a security device triggers an alarm, but there's actually no malicious activity or an actual attack taking place. So in other words, actually false positives are basically just false alarms, and they're also called benign triggers, right? Now, false positives are very problematic, and this is because by triggering unjustified alerts, you can actually diminish the value and urgency of real alerts, right? So if you have too many false positives to investigate, it becomes an operational nightmare, and you most definitely will overlook real security events. There are also false negatives, and a false negative is a term used to describe a network intrusion, and a device inability to detect true security events under certain circumstances. In other words, a malicious activity that is actually not being detected by a security device, right, or a security solution or software. A true positive is a successful identification of a security attack or a malicious event. So there's false positives, false negatives, true positives, and also true negatives. And a true negative is whenever the intrusion detection device or the security device identifies an activity as acceptable behavior, and the activity is actually acceptable, right? So that's actually a true negative. Now, traditional IDS and traditional IPS devices need to be tuned to avoid a lot of false positives and false negatives, right? One of the beauties of next generation IPS is actually that they do not need the same level of tuning as traditional IPS, and you can obtain much deeper reports and functionality, including, things like advanced malware protection and retrospective analysis to see what actually happens after an attack took place. And we cover, some of these in previous lessons, right? Now, traditional IDS and IPS devices also suffer from many evasion attacks, right? Here are some of the most common evasion techniques against traditional IDS and IPS devices. That includes, things like fragmentation, using low bandwidth attacks, address spoofing and proxying, pattern change evasions, and also encryption, right? Encryption can be problematic both for evasion and second, of course, to be able to actually analyze the data in the, within the organization.
Intrusion detection systems, IDSs, and intrusion prevention systems, IPSs, implement detection and prevention capabilities for unauthorized access to the network or to an information system. IDSs focus more on detection, whereas IPSs focus on threat or unauthorized access prevention. The main difference between an IDS and an IPS is the deployment mode. IDSs usually work on a copy of the packet from a tap or a span port and is mainly used to detect an issue or anomaly and alert the security analyst. This is called promiscuous mode. IDS may also include capabilities to enforce corrective action through other devices. For example, a firewall or a router that works as an enforcement point. For example, an IDS can communicate with a firewall device and ask the firewall to reset a connection. Because the IDS does not intercept the real packet, the response time to block a threat is lower than in an IPS system. Thus, some malicious packets may enter the network. An IPS, on the other hand, is deployed inline, which means it has visibility of the packets or threads as they flow through the device. Because of that, it is able to block a threat as soon as it is detected. For example, by dropping a malicious packet. The drawback of an IPS inline is that it adds additional latency due to the packet processing, and it may drop legitimate traffic in the case of a false positive. The figures here show examples of IDS and IPS deployment in inline and TAPS mode. We will utilize Wireshark to extract a file from a TCP stream. We start out by firing up Wireshark and selecting the interface we want to listen on. Once we see traffic, we'll then download a file over HTTP so that it's not encrypted and we can more easily extract it. Once we know we have captured those packets, we can stop the capture in Wireshark. From there, we need to export objects and select HTTP. We can see from the list that the file we downloaded is visible in the traffic. From there, we can simply download the file to the computer and open it.
With the Operations Center, you have to process a lot of different alerts, right? And doing that manually is close to impossible with the amount of data and the amount of traffic that most organizations, have to handle on a daily basis, right? You have to also search through suspicious indicators of compromise like emails, log messages, domains, URLs, IP addresses, etc., and then extract observables for enrichment to then determine whether these observables can be indeed breach or a specific attack, right? What you're seeing in the screen is basically Cisco Threat Response, and I'm actually using it through SecureX. It has the ability to do an investigation, right? And now in the investigate panel in the top, right, you see that there's one incident from my host being investigated, right? And there are 8 related things, right? And those things can be indicators of compromise like suspicious, URLs, also other IP addresses that are communicating to that specific host, as well as a specific file, right? So each of them you can, of course, deep dive and investigate, click on it, and go to the investigation. And also different observables, but specifically in this one, it is obvious that this device is actually communicating for potentially exfiltrating traffic from the organization, right? So you see here, that exfiltration being selected twice. And in that case, it can be that probably the attacker has compromised the device and is now trying to evade some of the security technology that you have in place and potentially exfiltrate data by also moving basically doing lateral movement by compromising all the devices in the network. Now, in short, what it is, and this is just an example, right? But what is really important for you to understand is that not every single event, of course, is a security incident, right? And then one security incident can have one or dozens of different events, right? You have to actually look in the context of what's actually happening, and these utilities like Cisco Threat Response, also StealthWatch, and many others, allow you to actually do that type of correlation. Now, in this screen, if I actually deep dive into the actual IP address that we're investigating, right, so the 108.62.141.250, it actually has several sightings, right? So basically different observables that we have seen, different events, and from many different types of security devices like Gigamon, a Threat Insight. It's a third-party application that is being integrated through SecureX in here. You see Cisco StealthWatch and for endpoints, and you also see next generation firewall event services, right, from like Firepower Threat Defense and many others. And you see that the actual confidence is high for each of those different events. Now, they are all related. In this case, it's actually potentially a malicious IP address, again, trying to communicate from an internal host to transfer a file. And specifically in the StealthWatch Enterprise, you actually see that, that was actually the case, right? It was actually trying to exfiltrate some file using FTP, right? File Transfer Protocol, or at least, some connection, out there. So this is the type of correlation and the type of activities that you need to increase your confidence of the fidelity of, your observables and events to determine whether it's actually a security incident or potential breach in this case, and so on.
Identification is the process of providing the identity of a subject or user. This is the first step in authentication, authorization, and accounting processes. Providing a username, a passport, an IP address, or even pronouncing your name is a form of identification. A secure identity should be unique in the sense that two users should be able to identify themselves unambiguously. This is particularly important in the context of account monitoring. Duplication of identity is possible if the authentication systems are not connected. For example, a user can use the same user ID for his corporate account and for his personal email account. A secure identity should also be non-descriptive so that information about the user's identity cannot be inferred. For example, using administrator as the user ID is generally not recommended. An identity should also be issued in a secure way. This includes all processes and steps in requesting and approving an identity request. This property is usually referred to as secure issuance. There are three categories of factors used in authentication. Knowledge, which is something the user knows. Possession, which is something a user has. And inheritance or characteristics, which is something the user is. Authentication by knowledge is where the user provides a secret that is only known by him or her. An example of authentication by knowledge would be a user providing a password or a personal identification number or answering security questions. The disadvantage of using this method is that once the information is lost or stolen, for example, if a user's password is stolen, an attacker would be able to successfully authenticate. Nowadays, a day does not pass without hearing about a new breach in retailers, service providers, cloud services, and other social media companies. Take a look at the Verist community database. There you'll see hundreds of breach cases where users' passwords were exposed. Websites like Have I Been Pwned include a database of billions of usernames and passwords from past breaches and even allow you to search for your email address to see if your account or information has been potentially been exposed. Something you know is knowledge-based authentication. It could be a string of characters referred to as a password or PIN, or it could be an answer to a question. Passwords are the most commonly used single-factor network authentication method. The authentication strength of a password is a function of its length, complexity, and unpredictability. If it is easy to guess or deconstruct, it is vulnerable to attack. Once known, it is no longer useful as a verification tool. The challenge is to get users to create, keep secret, and remember secure passwords. Weak passwords can be discovered within minutes or even seconds using any number of publicly available passwords, crackers, or social engineering techniques. Best practices dictate that passwords be a minimum of 8 characters in length, include a combination of at least 3 of the following characters, uppercase and lowercase letters, punctuation, symbols, and numerals, as well as changing frequently and being unique. Using the same password to log into multiple applications and sites significantly increases the risk of exposure. In NIST Special Publication 800-63B, Digital Identity Guidelines, Authentication and Lifecycle Management provides guidelines for authentication and password strength. NIST confirms that the length of a password has been found to be a primary factor in characterizing password strength. The longer the password, the better. Passwords that are too short are very susceptible to brute force and dictionary attacks using words and commonly chosen passwords. NIST suggests that the minimum password length that should be required depends to a large extent on the threat model being addressed. Online attacks, where the attacker attempts to log in by guessing the password, can be mitigated by limiting the rate of login attempts permitted. When talking about authentication by ownership or possession, this type of authentication is where the user is asked to provide proof that he owns something. For example, a system might require an employee to use a badge to access a facility. Another example of an authentication by ownership is the use of a token or smart card. Similar to the previous method, if an attacker is able to steal the object used for authentication, he will be able to successfully access the system. Examples of authentication by ownership or possession include the following: one-time password, memory cards, smart card, and out-of-band communication. The most common of the four is the one-time password sent to a device in the user's possession. A one-time password, or OTP, is a set of characteristics that can be used to prove a subject's identity one time and only one time. Because the OTP is valid for only one access, if captured, additional access would be automatically denied. OTPs are generally delivered through hardware or software token. The token displays the code, which must then be typed in at the authentication screen. Alternatively, the OTP may be delivered via email, text message, or phone call to a predetermined address or phone number. A memory card is an authentication method that holds user information within a magnetic strip and relies on a reader to process the information. The user inserts the card into the reader and enters a specific personal identification number. Generally, the PIN is hashed and stored on the magnetic strip. The reader hashes the inputted PIN and compares it to the value on the card itself. A familiar example of this is a bank ATM card. A smart card works in a similar fashion. Instead of a magnetic strip, it has a microprocessor and integrated circuits. The user inserts the card into a reader, which has electrical contacts that interface with the card and power the processor. The user enters a PIN that unlocks the information. The card can hold the user's private key, generate an OTP, or respond to a challenge response. Out-of-band authentication requires communication over a channel that is distinct from the first factor. A cellular network is commonly used for out-of-band authentication. For example, a user enters her name and password at an application login prompt, which is factor 1. The user then receives a call on her mobile phone. The user answers and provides the predetermined code, which is factor 2. For the authentication to be compromised, the attacker would have to have access to both the computer and the phone. A system that uses authentication by characteristic authenticates the user based on some physical or behavioral characteristic, sometimes referred to as biometric attributes. The most used physical or physiological characteristics are as follows: fingerprints, face recognition, retina or iris, palm and hand geometry, blood and vascular information, as well as voice recognition. Other examples of behavioral characteristics are signature dynamic, keystroke dynamic pattern. The drawback of a system based on this type of authentication is that it is prone to accuracy errors. For example, a signature dynamic based system would authenticate a user by requesting that the user write his signature and then compare the signature pattern to a record in the system. Given that the way a person signs his name differs slightly every time, the system should be designed so that the user can still authenticate even if the signature and pattern is not exactly the one in the system. However, it should also not be too loose and unintentionally authenticate an unauthorized user attempting to mimic the pattern. Two types of errors are associated with the accuracy of biometric systems. A type 1 error, also called false rejection, happens when the system rejects a valid user who should have been authenticated. A type 2 error, also called false acceptance, happens when the system accepts a user who should have been rejected. For example, an attacker trying to impersonate a valid user. The crossover error rate, or CER, also called the equal error rate, or EER, is the point where the rate of false rejection errors, or FRR, and the rate of false acceptance error, FAR, are equal. This is generally accepted as an indicator of the accuracy of biometric systems. In multi-factor authentication, the process of authentication requires the subject to supply verifiable credentials. The credentials are often referred to as factors. Single-factor authentication is when one factor is presented. The most common method of single-factor authentication is the use of passwords. Multi-factor authentication is when two or more factors are presented. Multi-layer authentication is when two or more of the same type of factors are presented. Data classification, regulatory requirements, the impact of unauthorized access, and the likelihood of a threat being exercised should all be considered when you're deciding on the level of authentication required. The more factors, the more robust the authentication process. Identification and authentication are often performed together. However, it is important to understand that they are two different operations. Identification is about establishing who you are, whereas authentication is about proving you are the entity you claim to be. In response to password insecurity, many organizations have deployed multi-factor authentication options to their users. With multi-factor authentication, accounts are protected by something you know, something you have. Even gamers have been protecting their accounts using MFA for years.